Today I'm going to be making a Manicotti Alla Romana. Never made it before, not even really sure if that's how you pronounce it, but who doesn't love Italian? And look this up on all recipes, it's got a good review, so try it with me. Let's make a delicious Italian dinner. Before I'd start making this recipe, I'd get out your beef. Just kind of let it warm up a little. This always makes meat taste a little better. The recipe I'm using, it is off of all recipes, but what I'm doing is I'm halving the recipe. That is, I'm only making half of it. So feel free to double, triple, quadruple, and that applies to most recipes. You can change them. Just make sure when you change one ingredient, you equally change all the ingredients. Don't double one thing and not double another. So keep in mind this is half the normal recipe I'm making. Alright, first things first, you're going to need half a diced onion. Now the people I'm cooking for don't like onion that much, so I'm going to use slightly less than half. But normally you'd want to cut this in half. But I'm just going to cut it like, I don't know, I'm going to use like a third of it. There you go, yeah. You can store the other part of it in a Ziploc bag or something. And then the way I'm going to cut this is I'm just going to cut it, kind of try to follow the grain a little. That way you kind of get narrow pieces, some strips. With me, I believe that the tinier they get, the less you can taste them. So I'm going to go kind of tiny with these. Okay, for me that's fine. Now the recipe I'm using calls for 3 cloves of garlic, but people I'm cooking for aren't the biggest fans of garlic, so I'm just going to use 2. Now I learned a tip for garlic is you put your blade to it and hit it, and that'll kind of crush it open and get the skin off, or most of it. And that also kind of releases the juices, which helps a lot. There we go. Now that we've cut up our onions and garlic, you need to take 2 tablespoons of olive oil, put them in a large saute pan, and put it over medium heat. The first thing you'll want to put in will be your onions. Now we're going to saute these until they become translucent, kind of like onions you would see on a burger or any other dish where they're kind of see-through. Okay, as most of them start to become translucent, you're going to want to add in your garlic. And it was specific, it said for the garlic, make sure you only cook it for a minute before adding your beef in. So. We're almost to a minute, so we can add in our beef and cook that. I would add in the beef at this point. Now you're going to want to cook this till it's crumbly and brown. You know, just like the color of a burger or steak, or, you know, don't let it be too raw. As you can see, this is starting to turn more brown, and it's getting a lot more crumbly, which is good. At this point, what you want to do is you're going to want to season it with some salt and then set it aside to cool while we work on the next step of this recipe. So I'm going to use some good old sea salt. Now you can just set it aside and make sure you turn off your burner. Now you need to bring 4 quarts of water to a boil. And what we're going to do is we're going to parboil the manicotti, which means we're only going to cook them halfway through a boil. And then we're going to put them in cold water so that they don't crack. And then we're going to stuff them with the beef, add a sauce, and then cook them later. So get your 4 quarts of water to a boil, and then add salt once it's boiling. Okay, now that it's starting to boil more rapidly, I'm going to add a little bit of salt to it for taste. Open up the manicotti. Now since we're parboiling it, we're just softening them. We're not cooking them all the way through. This box says to cook for 8 or 9 minutes, so I'm just going to cook for 3. And then we're going to drain them and put them in some cold water. So I would set your timer for a few minutes, and then gently put in your manicotti shells. Now this recipe calls for 6 ounces, but I am using 8. Okay, now that they've softened up a little bit, you've got to very carefully drain them. And then we need to put them in some cold water right away. This will prevent them from cracking. Now we can move on to our next step. Now that your beef mixture is cooled down, you're going to need to add a cup of ricotta cheese to it. Ricotta's pretty good. I don't really have it very often, but I was just tasting some and it's pretty good. It does remind me of Italian cooking. So get that in there. Mix that all around. Okay, once that's started to mix together well, you need to add 1 egg that's already been beaten really well. So, you know, break open an egg and whisk it. Now you need to spread 1/4 cup of spaghetti sauce into a 9x13 baking dish. I'm going to use a brush to do this, but you can use whatever. Okay, now here comes the tricky part, and I've never done this before, so hopefully this works well. What you need to do is you need to take your manicotti shells, and then you're going to have to stuff them with some of the mixture, which I've set closely. Stuff your mixture into it. Which this seems really more difficult than I thought, but see how far I've gotten in this one. Oh, it's good. It's starting to come to the other end more, which is good. Okay, then when you think it's pretty well stuffed, set it down in your sauce. Next it says to wrap these while you work on the sauce. That way they don't crack or dry out. Oops. There you go. Lock some of that moisture in there. There you go, that'll keep them dry. Wet. It'll stop them from drying. Next you need to preheat your oven to 350 degrees. And then we're going to work on the sauce. Now we're going to need to chop up parsley for 1/8 cup, which is just going to be like a small section. I like to get rid of the stems. I think they don't have a lot of flavor in them. You don't have to get rid of all of them, but just the bigger ones. We only need 1/8 cup, which isn't much. We also need a tablespoon of fresh basil, which is just going to be like a few leaves chopped up. I've been taught a good technique to chop basil is to just kind of twirl it. And just kind of cut it that way. It's looking pretty good. Now in a bowl or a saucepan over medium heat, you need to melt a tablespoon of butter. Now this is melted. You need to stir in a tablespoon of flour. And make sure you stir this constantly. And then also a tablespoon of chicken bouillon granules, which come in like little jars. They add like a chicken flavor to whatever you're making. Now you need to turn the heat to a medium-high. Make sure you keep stirring. And then you're going to look for it to bubble, which is what it's doing. Now that it's bubbling on medium-high, you need to pour in a cup of half and half and stir constantly. Now what you got to do is turn this to a high heat, and you got to bring it to a boil while stirring constantly. Okay, now you need to remove it from heat, and then you need to stir in your 1/8 cup of parsley. And then a tablespoon of basil. Now take the sauce you just made and lightly pour it over your manicotti. Try to get it kind of, even. Now it says to take your spaghetti sauce and then evenly pour it over that. Try to keep them layered, so gently pour them. You can really use as much sauce as you want at this point. It's kind of up to you. Now at this point you got to cover it and cook it for 30 to 40 minutes. And to cover it so that it doesn't, I'm going to cover it with aluminum foil, which can go in the oven at high temperatures. Alright, now I'm going to put this in our oven preheated at 350, and the recipe says to bake for 40 minutes, but because my oven is super frickin' hot, I'm just going to bake for like 30 or 35. At that point, you're going to take off the cover, put some parmesan on, and then bake it a little bit more so that the cheese melts. Alright, I'm going to check this again in half an hour. Okay, now that it's been 25 minutes, I'm going to pull this out and just look at it. It looks good. Sprinkle some parmesan on it. And continue cooking for 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to go like 6 or 7. Alright, I've let it cook with the parmesan on it for like 5 or 6 minutes. Smells pretty good. And it looks pretty good too. So don't be intimidated by this recipe. There's a few steps that go into it, but the result is you've got some gourmet looking Italian. So I hope you try this.